Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be painting these easy winter greenery stems, so let's jump right in. For supplies, I'm using Winsor & Newton cotton and watercolor. I also spray them lightly just to kind of loosen them up before painting. And for brushes, I use Princeton Select Artist brushes. I'm using a size 3. I have some water here, a ceramic palette to mix my colors, and some paper towel as well. So that's all we need for supplies. Now we can get started. I like to lightly trace out my designs on the watercolor paper just so I can have a guide as I go, but you can also just paint directly as you're doing it, whatever works for you. So we'll start off with this stem that has some green leaves and red berries. So we're going to start mixing those colors up using our palette here. So first I'll mix up a green for the leaves. I'm going for a bit of a dark, kind of warm green. Add some green. I'm going to add a little bit of brown to it. And really just mix up whatever kind of green you like, using a good bit of water to help your paint go a longer way. So that looks pretty good. I will start with that color. So we'll start off by outlining those leaves and the stem coming up from the bottom. I'm going to begin tracing that very skinny stem going up. And then while that's wet, I'll start painting the leaves in so those colors join together. And you really want to use the very tip of your brush to keep it pretty thin because that stem is super skinny. If you have a bit too much water, it can make it a little harder to keep it super sharp and fine, so you can dry the brush off between. That one's going to eventually be our berry going up there, but just kind of spreading the green up where it will go, and we'll join those when we do the berries. So there will be 3 stems here going off into some berries, and then these ones at the bottom are going to turn into the leaves. So there will be 1, 2, 3 leaf stems here. And grabbing a bit of water, I'm going to spread that water into the shape of this first leaf. Again, doing that all while the skinny stems are still wet. The colors kind of start to bleed together. And same thing here. Make the leaf, you can press down at the base and kind of release your brush into a point at the very tip of the leaf. So press down and then bring it to a point. Grab some more water, pressing down here and bringing it to a point. You can leave a little bit of a gap if you'd like, but for these ones, I'm just going to fill the color all the way in. And depending on the angle of the paper, sometimes I'll go in the other direction. So I'll grab a bit of water and a tiny bit of the green here and start in the opposite direction on this one. So start with the point, press down as the leaf gets bigger. The brush is a little dry there, take some more water. And then do the same on the other side, press down to the wider part of the leaf and bring it to a point and just kind of finesse that point the way you want it. And while those are wet, you can add water in to make sure they don't dry too much. Grab some of the green and drop it in to the base of the leaf to get a little bit of shading and watch it spread into the rest of the leaf. If you grabbed a bit much, you can dry your brush off between just to give you some control to where you want it to go. But it will mostly be the water that does the work for us here, so you don't want to overwork it too much. One of the really nice things about watercolor is just watching what it does if you let it kind of do its thing. But you can take little bits and drop them where you want to see more darkness around the edges of the leaf. So I go a bit around the edges here, tiny bit at the point, but not very much, and really concentrate it around the base. And then same with the other ones, just adding a little bit of detail around the edges, tiny bit at the tip, and more concentrated at the base of the leaf. That's pretty much it for the leaves. They're really simple. You can go in and add some more detail to the stem if you want to make it really kind of pop. But overall, that's the main idea. Now I'll let those dry and do one other little leaf at the top here. So joining onto this stem painted earlier, bringing it up to the side here, getting some water, and again, starting with the point here and then pressing down to get it wider in the middle and bringing it to a point again. And same here, press down in the middle and bring it up to a point. And by adding that water, you're kind of doing this wet on wet technique where your paper will already be wet, so it'll be super ready to pick up the color when you drop it in, and then it all blends really nicely together. So when we go and drop that green into the base, it all really bleeds together and spreads really well throughout the leaf. So dropping some of that green in, same as the other one, bringing a tiny bit of it to the surface, or bringing a tiny bit of it to the edges where we want that detail, but keeping it really more concentrated at the base here. And now that that is drying, we can move on to the berries. So these ones are going to be bright red berries. So we want to clean the green off our brush. Make sure that you don't have much of that color on there because you don't want it to mix up or to mix into your red. And then start by making a nice berry red. So I'm going to grab a bright red to begin. And I might add a bit of a darker red to it here too, just to get it to be nice and rich. I think that looks pretty good. So same general idea for this one. We're going to put a light wash using water over the whole shape of the berries, and then dropping more concentrated color around the edges. So starting with some water, grab some of that red, but keeping it very diluted to start to get the general shape of the berries, and then we'll start adding more of the color in. So with mostly water, tiny bit of red on my brush, going in and starting that first berry. I'm going to start with the one at the top. It feels a little bit weird to start all the way up here, but it does help to work top down and left to right. I'm right-handed, so it helps not drag my hands over the parts of the painting that are still wet. So we'll put that red wash down and using a good amount of water so that when we add more of the red color, it spreads really nicely throughout the berry. So there's one. Just paint a nice little circle. Since that's still pretty wet, I'm going to move on to the next berry. I don't want to add the color in while it's super wet because I don't want it to really bleed too much together. I want to be able to control where it is a little bit. So I'm going to move on to this one while letting that one dry. Just a tiny bit though, not totally dry. So we won't do all the berries. Just do a couple of them. Probably start with these two. And now start dropping some of our color in. So grab more of your red and bring that to the very base of the berry here where it'll be connecting to the stem. So drop that in, and same with this other one, drop some into the very bottom. And you can dry your brush if you want a bit more control over where it goes. If you dry your brush off, it kind of makes it really thirsty, so it drinks up the water where you touch the page. So for example here, I want to keep it a bit lighter in the center, so drying my brush, going in and picking up some of that color that's spreading there allows me to keep that really light wash in the center of the berry where I don't want it to be too red, because I really want the red, and I'll drop some more in here, to be concentrated around the edges and not in the center so that the berries look nice and round. Drying my brush again, and I'll do the same thing here. Picking up some of that color and just kind of perfecting some of the edges. Whenever I do a circle, I feel like it's never going to look like a circle, so I should probably just not mess with it too much and be okay with that fact. So dry my brush off again to pick up a bit more of that color here, and then drop a little bit more of the red into the very base of the berry here. We can add a bit more shading after they dry as well, so this isn't your only chance to add some dimension to it. So I'll leave those to dry a bit more for now and grab some water and get some really watered down red again to do the next berry here. So I'm going to move on to this one below and do that same little circle. probably just going to hop over to this one as well. And I'll just be very careful when working on that berry since this one won't be totally dry. As long as you're aware it's there and don't run your hand over it, it's no problem. Okay. And grab that red and start dropping it in. Here. And on that other berry. I'm going to let those spread a little bit more while I move on to the other two berries. And then I can go back and work with them a bit before they're totally dry. So I'll move on to a berry right over here, being careful to leave some space between those two, as I don't want them to really bleed together. I want two defined separate berries. So one, it's quite a bit of red on that one. You don't want as much as you put down the first time. Dry off your brush, make it, thirstier, and again, pick some of that up. That one will just dry a bit quicker. If you want to keep it wet for longer, you can dab a bit water on it. Really easy to work with watercolor in that way. And I'll take some of the darker red since this one's not as wet, and it should be ready for me to drop that in. I actually need to mix up some more red here. Running a bit low. There. Dropping that in. Now I'm drying off my brush so I can go and work a bit with these ones before they're dry. Really just smoothing out those edges. And I'm going to lift some of that paint in the center so it doesn't get too dark in the middle. So dry, dry, dry. Lift that up there. I always have to try to remember to dry my brushes in a nice way, not just like stab the paper towel. You'll damage your brushes pretty quickly and won't get as much use out of them if you kind of just rub them all over. So trying to keep them drying in the way that the bristles are angled really helps get some longer wear out of them. Now this one here too. Okay, and I'll move on to that last little berry off in the corner. So water, tiniest bit of red. Make this little guy over here. I'm just going to dry off my brush and help speed that one along with the drying. So picking up some of that color, but still having it wet enough that it'll blend well when we drop this red in. Grab that red, drop it in, and watch it spread around. Now while that one's drying, I'm going to go add even a little bit more detail to these ones that we did earlier. So now that it's mostly dry, if you go in and add the color like this, you'll see that it doesn't blend really well because it's dry. So I like to go in with more concentrated color, keep very little on my brush to have more control, and just use it to add shading. Because it's not going to blend, you have to be more precise with where you're putting it, since where you put it down is mostly where it will stay, depending on how wet or dry your berries are. Just going to add a little bit of shading to that one. This one. Tiniest bit around the outside corner, but not as much because there is more light shining from the top in this image. So it's more so the bottom that's going to have a bit more color. And if you add it where you don't want it, you can take a tiny little bit of water to kind of spread it out, dry your brush, and pick it back up. So watercolor can be kind of reworked like that if you have a bit too much where you've put it. But if you do that too much, it'll make your paper really pilly and kind of overworked. So you want to try to avoid going back in and moving colors a bunch and just focus on putting them down where you'd like them to be from the start. So grabbing some more of that detail red and going into this berry now as well. Just a little bit of shading around the bottom. And then these ones, the shading will be a bit kind of angled over here and here, here. And then I'm going to grab a tiny bit of darker red to add to my red. So I can do a little dot on each berry to show where I don't know what it is, but you know when there's a berry, it'll have like a little dot on one end and a stem on the other. I should have looked up the anatomy of a berry so I know what I'm talking about before painting them, but we're just going to add that little dot on each one with a version of red. So going to the very top here, I'm just going to add a tiny little dot like that, one over here, one right here, this one kind of angled over here, there, and one more over here. Dry off my brush and just add any other little minor details you want to the edges of your berries. If you want to make them more defined or clean up the edges a bit, now is the time. And then when we're done that, we will move on to the stems that join the berries to the greenery, and then we'll add a couple of details to the leaves. Then move on to the green again, so I can add those stems. So getting that green and really using a very fine tip of this brush because they're so skinny going up to the berries. And I'll start off with that top one. And I'm going to bring it from the berry down to meet the stem. You could do it in either direction, just a very fine line. So you don't want a ton of water here, but enough to help the paint blend. So if it's like the line is skipping or it seems too dry or gritty, you can add a little bit more water to move it along, but not so much water that it kind of overflows your clean lines. And then you can paint over the stem you already had a little bit to help really join them together. And just bring it down from each berry using that very fine tip. And these on the side here too. This one I'm going to curve it a little bit down and over. This one's going to kind of go through those two berries. So I'm going to start from the stem side and curve it up. And this one I'll bring out the side like that. Right there. Okay. And if it bleeds a little bit into your berry or it wasn't totally dry, I think that's totally fine. It can be just kind of a part of the design, but you could also wash your brush off, dry it, and just go in there and stop that mingling while it's happening. So clean the brush off and then just use it to kind of interrupt the green bleeding into that red. Then we'll take that same green and add a little bit of detail to those leaves just to finish it off. I'm going to use some water to really spread that green, add a bit more color too, but I do want to add quite a bit of water so it's more of a wash, but drying my brush to make sure I get that really nice point. And take that point, grab some of that green wash and just use it to add detail over the leaves without it being pigmented enough to really change how the leaves look. So for example, this top one, I'm going to add just a tiny little line in that wash going from the stem up. And I'm also going to just redefine the edge a bit here. I'm going to take some more of that green and add a line on this one too. So going from the stem, very fine line up through the center of the leaf, about 3/4 of the way. And just adding a little bit of detail, some of the edges and the base. And the same for these other leaves. So I'm going about 3/4 of the way up the leaf, but you can make the line as short or as long as you want it to be. Just trying to show that curve where a leaf kind of folds in half, where the shadows would hit it at the base. And last one, bit of water here, bring up that line. And there we have our first little stem with some red berries. Now we'll set that one aside and move on to the next one. So for this stem, we're going to be painting a nice little wintry bluish green stem with some blue frosty berries on it. So it's going to be a really cool tone, blue/green. So starting out by mixing a base green, and then we'll add some blues to it to really bring it to that cool side, using a lot of water as well. And for this one, I'm going to have one version that is a bit more bluish and one version that is a bit more green, so that I can kind of mix them into the leaf together. So this one's kind of like a darker teal green, and this one is more of a light bluish version. Adding the tiniest drop of black to kind of make it a bit more ashy toned. I should show the colors I'm mixing here. So just adding little bits of blue to this one, and also keeping some green mixed in until I get the look I'm going for. These are all going to be really diluted when we're painting with them. Just cleaning the colors I had from the last stem to make sure I'm going to have room for everything I need to do here. Right, and then we'll start putting that paint down using our nice size 3 brush here. Start putting that paint down over those leaves. Then I'm also going to mix kind of a brown to be the stem. So I'm going to start by taking a bit of brown, whatever kind of brown, just on its own, and get that to a nice light color that looks cohesive with those blues and greens. So I might add like the tiniest bit of blue to it, just to see what happens there. Tiny, tiny bit of blue. And that looks like the color I'm going for. So the very first thing I'm going to do is take that brown and start outlining the base, like the main stem that's going to be joining into the berries and the leaves. So it'll start down here and go all the way up to the berries. So I'll bring that first line all the way through, keeping it really fine the whole way, making sure you have a nice point on your brush, which will require enough water to keep it really pointed, but not so much that it floods and makes your line too thick. And then we'll have 2 going off to the sides here for 2 little berries. So one here, another one here. And we don't need too much where it'll be joining the leaves, because the leaves are really gonna start very close to the stem. So those ones can be very short when it comes to the brown. Just kind of keep going over them and joining them together. And there will be one more berry down here, so this one's gonna have a bit of a longer stem. Since I've got the colors all mixed up for those, I'm using this green first, but really watering it down how we did with the other leaves to give that base and then start adding color into it. So using that watered down green, I'm going to begin with this leaf at the top first. So you can take your brush and start at a point where the leaf joins the stem, press it down to get that wider part. And this one's going to be a bit more curved at the end. I want these to be a little bit rounder. And then I'll bring it the other way to join them. And then you can just fill in the center there and get that nice outline going for that curved leaf shape. Now taking some of these colors while it's still wet, grabbing some of the darker teal green and drop that at the very base. You can kind of bring some of it up the sides and guide it to where you want it to go. Wash my brush off and dry that and grab some of the blue. And I want a bit of that up here. And you can drop a bit more water in if you want them to really mingle more. And if you want it to be lighter in the center of the leaf, dropping some water there helps tell the paint to move aside from that part. And you can always dry off your brush and pick up a bit of the paint to really keep it light in the center. Now I'll move on to this one over here. So again, taking mostly water, a little bit of green, and we'll start with a point, press down, and curve that end. And again, point, press down, and curved in at the tip there. And then grab some of that green, drop it in at the base, and in a few other parts. Dry the brush, grab some of the blue, keeping it pretty watered to keep it moving nicely, and drop that in maybe at the tip here. Dry the brush and pick a little bit of it up at the center. And then just kind of grabbing some of the green to guide the details along where you want them. And we can always add them after it dries, so you don't have to work with it too much for now. Just generally getting that color down on the paper is a good starting point. And now for these other leaves, I'm going to start with the tip on this one here. And press down at the center and bring it down into a point to join the stem. You can do it in either direction. Press down and a point, and then you can just guide the shape how you want it to go. Drop in your green or teal, dry your brush, wash that off and grab some of the more blue. Dry the brush, pick some of that up at the center, really reminding it to stay at the edges. And just let that dry. I'm going to need to mix some more of that blue for the next one, I think. Just add a little bit of water and a tiny bit of color to it. Should be good enough to keep it going for the last leaf. Grab some of that very light base color, and we'll do this last leaf over here. Starting with a point at the stem, press down and bring it to a curved end for the leaf. And I'll start again at the stem here, point, press down, and meet those together. Grab the teal, dry my brush, grab a bit of water to clean that off and get the blue. Really don't need too much of that blue color, I think, because it actually goes a long way. Dry the brush and pick some of that up in the center, using some green to really guide it along the edges here. And we'll let that dry.
I'm going to use that blue as inspiration to start mixing the color of our berries. So taking some blue, and to get that kind of frosty winter look, I like to add a little bit of purple. I don't want it to be too blue. I want it to be a little bit between bluish and purple. Adding a tiny, tiny bit of black to this to really make it a bit more frosty and ashy looking.
And just go until you have a blue that looks like the color you want for your berries. And this is going to be very similar to the red berries, where we'll take a watered down version of this and put that down as the base, and then just add the color around the edges to give it some dimension. So I'll start off with this one at the top here. Just put that watered down blue into a circle for the base. I'll move on to doing the second berry beside it as well while that one dries. I'm going to grab a bit more water and just drop it in the center of both of those to move the water nicely to the edges. So I don't want the blue to be too concentrated. So dropping some water into the center, drying off my brush, and picking it up from the center as well, and then kind of guiding it to the edges of the berry. There we go. Now those are still quite wet, so I'm going to let them dry briefly, while I move on to the next one, and then I'll go put the color in around the bottom. So again, really light watered down blue, and paint that into that berry shape. Grabbing some water to spread it around. Dry my brush, pick some of that up from the center. Now I'll go back into those other berries with the darker blue and drop that in at the bottom. So really concentrating where the berry meets the stem. So it'll be a bit different on each one. And just drop your color in there. And then you can dry off your brush so you don't have the really dark blue on it, and just kind of guide it a bit where you want it to go without overworking it too much. Then we'll let that dry and it should make its way to where we want it to go. I'll grab that watered down blue and finish the last berry over here. Taking some water into the center, drying my brush and picking that up. And then taking that darker blue and dropping it at the base where it meets the stem. Now while those berries dry,
we can clean our brush off and go and add some details with a very fine point to the leaves that we did earlier. So I'm going to grab some of that darker green, and I might even grab a little bit of this brown
to make a very light green wash, and use that to add some details in and just go over the parts where the stem joins the leaves to really bring them together. So going up a little bit on these, a little bit more water, mine's quite concentrated here. More water, bring it to a really nice fine point. And just bringing those lines and some details around the very base of the leaves. This one here, I want it curving a bit out this way. And then while that's a bit wet, I'm going to grab some of the brown and join it to the stems again a little bit more freshly to give it some more detail. And bringing that down all the way through the stem, adding a bit more detail, bringing it back up to the other leaves. And they might bleed together the tiniest bit at the stem, but I think that just makes them look really natural and joined together, so that works. And taking any of that green wash where you feel you need a bit more detail on the leaves. It's really up to you. I like to add a bit more around the edges just to give it kind of an outline and some definition, but not all the way on all the edges. You can always dry off your brush and blend out your detail lines a bit too. Since your leaf is dry, they'll stand out quite well wherever you put them. So where you put them down, they won't really spread from there. So it's important to have them look nice and like what you're hoping for. So that looks good for now. I'm going to grab some of that brown and go over the stems, joining the berries as well. Just making them a bit thicker and more detailed. And for the last step, I'm going to get that blue, so washing my brush off here, grabbing some of that blue, and I'm going to add a bit of detail and shading to the berries. So taking that blue with quite a bit of water to it to allow us to put that wash layer over top. Very fine point on the brush. I'm going to add some detail around the bottom of the berry. And these are very big berries, so I want them to look nice and round. So adding some nice shading around there, and then you can dry off your brush and use that to spread it out a bit if it's looking a bit too concentrated. And just go do that to the outside edge of every berry using very watered down version. You can always add more color later, but when adding these final details, you don't want to go too heavy-handed because you can't take away color, and if you're building it on color that's already there, it can make it even trickier. You can use a bit of water like this to water dry that off a little to help blend it more, but it is more tricky to do that once your first layer is dry. So taking that watered down blue and just adding it very carefully, initially very sparingly, to where you feel it would work best. And then using water, just a little bit of water if you need to blend it in. If you use too much water and your layer underneath is dry, it's going to leave like a very crunchy kind of edge when it dries into the first layer, which is fine. That's also a nice look if that's what you're going for. But if you're just trying to add some shading, you want more of a nice blend between those two layers. There we go. Now I'm going to take a little bit of water, just blend this last one out, tiniest bit, dry my brush and pick a bit of it up if there's too much. And then grab some water to spread the last little bit of blue I have left. I might need to add a bit more blue here because it's pretty much gone. And I'm going to add the same little dot to the tips of my berries. Very fine little dot where you think the top of them is. And there is our stem. Looks almost like a blueberry stem, like a wintry, frosty blueberry stem. And there we have two simple, versatile winter greenery options. I hope you enjoyed painting these today. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you again next time.